Hello there, my name is Ian and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the 2025 2 CD and 1 Blu-ray edition of Camel's Mirage. This is one of the 4 Camel reissues that have come out this month. That list also includes Moon Madness from 1976, Nude from 1981, and finally the Pressure Points film from 1984. 1975's The Snow Goose will follow in late May. Originally released in 1974, this edition of Mirage comes in a clamshell box and is a reprint of the Ben Wiseman remaster and Stephen W Tayler stereo and 5.1 mixes. These mixes and extras, including demos, a studio outtake, and an early mix of Lady Fantasy, were previously released in the Airborne, MCA, and Decca Years box set. Now, before some of you cry out cash grab, remember that the Airborne set was quite expensive at the time it was released, and hardly geared toward the average fan. And now it's out of print anyway, and even pricier than before. I, for one, consider myself a so-called casual fan of Camel. I probably heard them around 10 years ago or so, and the versions that I first listened to were the early 2000s remasters. The albums that I would be most familiar with are Mirage, Snow Goose, and Moon Madness. I also had the debut in my collection 10 years ago, but when I started my audio business, I sold off most of my CDs, meaning that these reissues from Esoteric are actually a great way to rediscover these classic albums. So, some background on the band Camel. Camel are a 1970s progressive rock band formed in Guildford, UK. When I think of Camel, what comes to mind is the sort of classically informed, jazzy, light, mostly instrumental take on prog, best exemplified by their album, The Snow Goose. They generally have a much softer side when compared to other bands of the era, and might best be compared to the likes of Pink Floyd or Genesis. There's also a guitar-led jazz fusion element coupled with rock that means that their records could sit comfortably within the same collection as Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow, or even Caravan and their album In the Land of Grand Pink. Actually, about 10 years ago when I first discovered them, I purchased this album, Mirage, and Caravan's In the Land of Grand Pink on the same day. So they've always been kind of associated to one another for me, and sometimes when I start thinking about Lady Fantasy, some of the riffs from 9 Feet Underground start to pop into my head. So it's really strange how these things can kind of meld together in one's mind. Of course, in later years, they would include members of Caravan, namely Richard and later Dave Sinclair. But of course, that's not the material that we'll be discussing today. So the classic lineup, and the one featured on the first 5 albums, including Mirage, is as follows. Andrew Latimer, guitar, flute, vocals. Peter Bardens, keyboards, vocals. Doug Ferguson, bass guitar. And finally, Andy Ward on drums. Their classic 70s sound to me is typified by the dual guitar and keyboard lines, shared by Andy Latimer and Peter Bardens respectively, that sometimes, alternatively, reminds me of the relationships shared by Pink Floyd's David Gilmour and Rick Wright, not to mention Steve Hackett and Tony Banks of Genesis. Andy Latimer's voice is at times difficult for me to reconcile with. It's not necessarily bad, and it is very authentic sounding. In fact, it seems to grow on me more and more all the time as I listen to these records. It often actually puts me in the mind of David Gilmour's singing voice. But strangely, I feel that the era of Gilmour I'm referring to didn't really occur until the mid to late 80s and early 90s. I also feel that Camel's music is a lot more interesting than a lot of that 80s and 90s Pink Floyd and David Gilmour material. One unique feature of Camel, though, is Andy Latimer's guitar playing, which I feel is entirely his own. Sure, he might make me think of a little of this player or that player, such as Robin Trower, but he's built his own vocabulary of sounds and phrasings that I can't mistake for anyone else. I would, in fact, suggest that Andy's guitar playing, coupled with his flute playing, is what draws me the most to this very interesting and unique band. Of course, the other guys in the band are great too, and I really appreciate Andy Ward's funky drumming. which, in my mind, puts Camel in a slightly different category than their contemporaries. Sure, their music is more lightweight than the likes of Tall, Genesis, and Yes, and even borders on soft rock at times. But what I find fascinating about them is how they manage to be so accessible and easy to listen to, while also drawing much influence from experimental, jazz fusion, and Canterbury acts like Caravan and Soft Machine. Bassist Doug Ferguson especially holds the band down for me on these early albums. His approach is decidedly more simplistic than the others, but he's really the glue that holds this entire thing together. So of all the Camel records that I've heard so far, which isn't especially many of them, I believe Mirage is the most hard-rocking. Tunes like Freefall would sit neatly amongst the likes of hard rock guitar albums like Robin Trower's Bridge of Sighs. However, some of the more interesting stuff to me, on this album at least, are the more moody progressive numbers like Super Twister, Earthrise, and White Rider, and I appreciate how the two approaches balance one another. For instance, Lady Fantasy is a merger of both of these disparate styles, but to me, the one track that points most to their future direction taken on the Snow Goose album is Earthrise. The instrumental song Super Twister, with its haunting odd-time flute riffs and moody piano and organ runs, is my favorite song on the album. I could be biased. I am a flautist, and I've always gotten a hard time for playing flute from my rock and roll friends. For that, it's really refreshing to me that Andrew Latimer is a total artist on the guitar, yet his flute playing is equally magical and captivating. In some ways, this is perhaps the most naive sounding of the three records Esoteric have reissued, Moon Madness and Nude being the other two, and that's to be perfectly expected given that it's their second effort. I feel sometimes like the references to other bands can be a little heavy-handed, such as Tall, Genesis, and Yes, but it's tied together by the unique approach to melody. These melodies get stuck in my head for days and days and keep me coming back. That said, I do think Mirage is an especially strong introduction to the world of Camel, as it was my introduction to the world of Camel, given that its basis is in a lot of more accessible hard rock and prog tropes, but it's woven together by the band's unique melodic sense. So in this deluxe edition 2 CD and 1 Blu-ray set, you do have the original 1974 album mix by Ben Wiseman, and I feel that fans of the original stereo mixes should be pleased by Wiseman's work. This does sound a whole lot better to me than what I remember the 2000s-ish CD sounding. It's not compressed or brick-walled to my ears in the slightest, and it sounds warm and natural. In some ways, I actually prefer the Wiseman stereo remaster for listening in stereo, but I'll get to that more in a moment. It's clearly a quantum leap ahead of the early 2000 CD masters that I had and grew up on. I really think that the advantage to these sets is that the original mixes are presented here with decent mastering, and you also get Stephen W Tayler's mixes, which are very faithful and add only clarity and nuance. Although I will get to a few minor complaints I have. It's maybe a tiny bit redundant to have all these different mixes, but I like having it all here, and certainly either one of these mixes blows the doors off of the previous released version that I had heard. So, on to the 5.1 mix. From a strictly sonic perspective, I think that this album, Mirage, is not quite as good sounding as the ones that followed, particularly Moon Madness, which was produced by Rhett Davies. But Stephen W Tayler's 5.1 mixes do a really decent job, in my opinion, of replicating the wall of sound production style of the original stereo mix, but translated to the multi-channel environment. I should begin by saying that I admire Stephen W Tayler's 5.1 surround sound work immensely, and I feel his work proves that Steven Wilson is not the only game in town. If you look at his credits, he's been at it for a few extra decades than Steven, and I think it really shows in the work. Okay, his mixes don't take nearly as many chances with panning or spatial effects like Wilson's do, but what he does offer are faithful recreations of the stereo mixes, transformed three-dimensionally. And I feel like his work with Van der Graaf Generator proves this too. Tayler's 5.1 mixes are subtle and non-gimmicky. Many times they are quite front-heavy, but everything has its own place within the mix and room to breathe. He does tend to place a lot of reverb, keyboards, rhythm guitars, backing vocals, and overdubs in the back channels, and he leaves the bass and guitar and kind of more prominent rhythm parts up into the front. In other words, the background is often in the back speakers, and the foreground is in your front and center channels. Rather simple, really. I do think that the 5.1 mixes sound a little better overall than the stereo mixes, but you really can't go wrong with either. Though, as I mentioned, I do have a couple of minor complaints, and this is one that I would extend to the Blu-ray of both Mirage as well as Moon Madness. And that's that the same images play during the playback of the albums while you listen to them. This could be simply explained by a lack of availability of images from this time period. And if this is something that really bothers you, you can just turn your screen off. That's what I do. I often turn my screen off when listening to 5.1 mixes anyway. The only other critiques I really have of the remixes of Mirage is that I don't care much for the added phaser on the drums of the Lady Fantasy intro. I also think in some ways I prefer the original mix overall for stereo listening, especially for a more hard rock track like Freefall, which can get a little bit too reverby for my tastes on both his stereo and 5.1 mixes. The rest of the tracks, however, such as The White Rider and Super Twister, Earthrise, and most of Lady Fantasy, sound absolutely stunning and intoxicating, in particular Super Twister. I just find that I prefer the drier original mixes at times for those harder rock songs and sections of the songs. So on to the extras. On disc 1, we have a series of demo sessions that were recorded for Decca prior to the album's recording sessions. I actually very much appreciate these demos. They are much looser than the album versions and sometimes feature extended sections and alternate solos. I like them very much because they are a fascinating snapshot into what the band must have sounded like on stage at the time. So I'm not going to talk about each and every one of them, but I'll kind of discuss my highlights and some standouts. For one thing, the version of Earthrise, which opens the demo section, is quite a bit extended, and it's a nice treat since, in particular, I enjoy that piece. Also, there's an unreleased song that I don't think they ever recorded. You folks who are more experts on the Camel history might be able to tell me if this was re-recorded for a later album, but I've never heard of this track before. It's called The Traveler, and it's a burner, and it's got some great vintage guitar work from Andy Latimer. It's a very Zappa-esque shuffle with sparse lyrics. The lyrics really only appear in the last half, and it clocks in at just under 10 minutes in length. Superb to discover something unheard like this. It's excellent. I also really enjoy the looser versions of songs like Super Twister and Lady Fantasy. I'm not sure if these were released prior to the Airborne box set, but I found these a lot more interesting than I had thought I would. Oftentimes when these box sets feature a lot of demo versions and alternate mixes, I tend to suffer fatigue and burnout and just kind of get tired of hearing the same thing. But I find that these demo sessions are different enough from the finalized Mirage studio album tracks to warrant their inclusion. And I think for fans, you're going to want to revisit these a couple of times. It's also curious that disc 1 of this set, which also includes the 1974 album mix mastered by Ben Wiseman, is 80 minutes and 6 seconds long. I've never seen a CD go past the 79 and change minute mark. So seeing something go over 80 minutes just kind of took me back a little bit. I'm not sure what to make of this, but I thought I'd mention it since it's very unique. Also included on the Stephen W Tayler remix disc, which is disc 2, of course, as well as the Blu-ray, is a studio session outtake, Autumn. I don't remember hearing this song on the older master of Mirage, so it's completely new to me. It's a very pretty song, if a bit unremarkable, but it's nice to have it in 5.1 either way. And oddly, it kind of reminds me of the style that somebody like Steven Wilson would develop decades later. There's also an alternate mix of Lady Fantasy included on the Stephen W Tayler remix CD. It's actually not that much different from the one that they released, but it does seem to be a tiny bit longer in a few places. Hardcore Camel fans might enjoy this, and I did notice, of course, some mix variants, but I think I heard this before. I think it was released previously on that 2000s edition of Mirage. So, do I recommend it? Well, yes. If you don't have the box set, I think it's worth picking up, especially since the box set is out of print and probably won't be reprinted because it was on a different label. But if you already have the box set, there's really not that much new here for you. This is more something for somebody like me to dig into because I didn't have the opportunity to get the Airborne box set. But don't forget to let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. What do you think about these two mixes? Which one do you prefer? The original, the stereo remixes, or the 5.1 remixes? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget that I also ordered Moon Madness as well as the 1981 album Nude, and I skipped the live album Pressure Points, but I ended up enjoying these three albums much more than I anticipated. So if you would like to hear me talk about the live Blu-ray, also let me know in the comments because I could pick that up, and I do intend to pick up the Snow Goose 5.1 when it's released in May. Okay, that's it for me for today. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. That's the best way to show your support and to encourage me to create more content. And if you don't want to miss my thoughts on the other two Camel releases, that's the best way to keep tabs. Until then, my name's Ian, and it's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I'll catch you real soon. Bye-bye.